40 minutes before I walked down the aisle, my mother sent me one text. Something's come up with Melissa's anniversary. We need to be there. I stood in my wedding dress reading it 3 times, waiting for the part that made sense. It never came. My name is Danielle, and this story does not slow down. Stay with me. I need to move fast here, because that's exactly how it happened to me. I called my mother immediately, hands already shaking. What celebration? What's happening right now, today on my wedding day? Her answer landed like a slap, dressed up as reasonableness. Melissa's husband had planned a surprise 10-year vow renewal. That same afternoon, overlapping my ceremony almost exactly. I know the timing is unfortunate, my mother said. Unfortunate, like weather. But this is such a special celebration. We feel like we need to be there for her. A vow renewal isn't even legally binding. Mine was my actual wedding. She said it anyway. I spent the next 3 hours calling everyone, my father, my brother Tyler, my grandmother, and got the same story, piece by piece, like watching a wall collapse in slow motion. Every single one of them had chosen Melissa's party. Every single one. I want you to picture this with me for 1 second. I walked down my own aisle in a room full of Marcus's family and my closest friends, and the entire section reserved for my parents, my siblings, my grandmother, empty. Every chair. I smiled. I said my vows. I compartmentalized so hard I don't fully remember the ceremony itself, because that's what you do when you refuse to let the worst day of your life also become the day you cried through your own wedding photos. My father showed up, halfway through the reception, alone. He'd snuck away once Melissa's party wrapped up, meaning he chose to stay for the whole thing before coming to see any part of mine. Here's where it gets worse. Give me a second, because it does. 3 weeks of near silence followed. Deflection every time I tried to talk about it. And then, piece by piece, through extended family members who'd actually been at Melissa's celebration, the real timeline came out, and it broke something different in me than the day itself had. The vow renewal wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a last-minute surprise. Melissa's husband had been planning it for 6 weeks. My entire family had known about the conflict for 6 weeks. And they said nothing. Not a warning. Not a heads up. Nothing. Until 40 minutes before I needed to walk down an aisle with no time left to fight for anything. They didn't make a rushed decision under pressure. They made a calculated one, and timed the reveal so I'd have no room to object. I confronted my mother 2.5 weeks later. You knew for 6 weeks, I told her. You let me walk down that aisle without my family there, and you waited until the last possible minute to tell me, because you knew if I had more time, I'd fight for my wedding to matter as much as hers. Her answer is the sentence I will never fully get over. Melissa's marriage has always felt more fragile than yours. We worried our absence might actually damage things for her. Your relationship with Marcus has always felt so solid. We didn't think our absence would threaten anything important for you. Read that again. My stability was used as the reason I didn't deserve my family in the room. I thought that was the bottom. It wasn't. 3 weeks after my wedding, my phone rang. My mother again. I actually let myself hope, for one stupid second, that this was the apology I'd been waiting for. Melissa and her husband are dealing with some unexpected costs from the vow renewal, she said. The venue charged more than they budgeted. We were hoping, as a family, everyone could pitch in to help cover the difference. Sit with that. 3 weeks after skipping my wedding for that exact party, she called to ask me to help pay for it. You're asking me to help fund the celebration you all chose over my wedding, I said. Do you understand what you're actually asking me right now? Silence. Not guilty silence. Confused silence. The silence of someone who genuinely didn't see anything wrong with the request until I said it out loud. That silence told me more than any argument could have. This wasn't a one-time failure. This was just how my family had always worked, and I was only now looking directly at it. I said no. Melissa and my mother both call me selfish for it. Sit with the audacity of that for a second, because I still do. Now let me take you back. All the way back. Because you don't get the full weight of that aisle unless you understand exactly what built up to it. I'm the middle of 3, Melissa, older, then me, then my younger brother Tyler. For as long as I can remember, Melissa occupied a specific gravitational position in this family that neither Tyler nor I ever got assigned to ourselves. Not through anything dramatic she did. Just some invisible, long-standing family math that always, quietly, tilted her way. I want to give you the receipts, because a pattern like this doesn't announce itself in one moment. It shows up in 100 small moments you're taught not to count. When Melissa graduated college, my parents rented an event space. Catering. A DJ. 40 guests. When I graduated 2 years later, with honors, in a considerably harder program, we celebrated with a family dinner at a restaurant. Nice. Ordinary. A noticeably different scale, and I noticed it in real time, and said nothing, because I'd already learned, by then, exactly what happened when I said something. I want to fast forward through a dozen smaller versions of this same story because I could give you 20 examples and none of them alone would sound like much. That's the trick of it. Individually, they're nothing. A slightly shorter phone call, a slightly smaller gift, a slightly less enthusiastic, "That's great, honey." Stacked over 2 decades, they become a shape you can finally see, but only once you step far enough back. I remember one conversation with Tyler specifically, both of us adults by then, comparing notes over drinks about a childhood we'd apparently both lived through separately without ever naming it out loud to each other. "It's like we were always background characters in Melissa's story," he told me. I've never forgotten that sentence. I don't think I ever will. When Melissa got married 8 years ago, our entire family threw a full year of coordinated effort into it. Dress shopping trips, venue tours, long, detailed group discussions about flowers and seating charts that every single family member contributed time and money toward. I remember helping address 200 invitations by hand at my parents' kitchen table, genuinely happy to do it, genuinely excited for her. When I got engaged to Marcus, roughly 18 months before our own wedding date, the congratulations were warm. I want to be fair about that. Nobody was cruel. But they were smaller. Noticeably, measurably smaller. And I clocked it immediately, the way you clock a temperature change in a room, and I said nothing. Again, I want to walk you through the actual planning of my wedding now, because you need to understand exactly how blindsided I was, and blindsided doesn't happen without a baseline of trust first. Marcus and I planned something modest but genuinely meaningful. A small vineyard venue an hour outside the city, 80 guests, close family, and close friends. My mother was involved, in pieces, less intensively than she'd been for Melissa's wedding years earlier. I noted it privately. I didn't raise it. I'd learned, from years of prior attempts, that raising this specific comparison never produced anything except defensive dismissal, and I didn't have the bandwidth, 18 months into planning my own wedding, to fight a battle I already knew I'd lose. Now here's the moment the story really starts. 6 weeks before my wedding, at a family dinner, almost as an offhand comment, Melissa mentioned she and her husband were thinking about something for their upcoming 10-year anniversary. Vague, undeveloped, or so she said. I remember nodding, genuinely happy for her, and moving on, because I had 80 guests in a vineyard venue and 100 logistics of my own eating every spare hour of my life. I had no idea. None. That thinking about something was, at that exact moment, already fully planned, already scheduled, and deliberately, specifically kept from me. I want to walk you through the morning itself now, because I think you deserve the full, slow-motion version of exactly how this fell apart, not just the highlight reel. I woke up at the venue that morning, having stayed overnight with my bridesmaids, filled with the kind of uncomplicated excitement you only get to feel once. Hair and makeup, someone playing music low in the background, my best friend crying happy tears before I'd even put the dress on. I had absolutely no idea, in that entire golden morning, what was simultaneously unfolding somewhere else. 10 in the morning, 4 hours before my ceremony. That text. Something's come up with Melissa's anniversary celebration today. We need to be there. We'll try to make it to your reception if we can. I read it 3 times. I genuinely could not make the words rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Something's come up, regarding a celebration I understood, until that exact second, to be some vague future plan, not an event apparently happening that very same afternoon. I called her immediately, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice. "Mom, what is happening? What celebration for Melissa is happening today, on my wedding day?" And there it was, delivered in a tone so matter-of-fact it almost sounded reasonable if you didn't listen too closely. Melissa's husband had organized a surprise 10-year vow renewal. That same afternoon, overlapping my ceremony almost exactly. "I know the timing is unfortunate," she said. Unfortunate. Like it was weather. Like it was something that had simply happened to all of us, rather than something they'd chosen. But this is such a special once-in-a-decade celebration. Melissa's husband put so much effort into planning it as a surprise. We feel like we need to be there to support her. I want you to sit, for 1 second, in the specific vertigo of that moment. My mother was seriously, genuinely suggesting that a vow renewal, a ceremony with 0 legal weight, a party, essentially, should take priority over my actual wedding. The one I'd spent 18 months planning. The one that would legally begin my marriage. "Mom, this is my wedding," I said, voice cracking despite everything in me fighting to stay composed, because I was less than 4 hours from walking down an aisle. "This isn't some anniversary party. This is the one time this happens. I need my family here. I understand you're upset," she said. "But Melissa really needs us today, and I think once you understand the full situation, you'll agree this was the right call." The right call. I want you to hold on to that phrase, because it comes back later, and it gets worse. I spent the next 3 hours, on my own wedding morning, calling everyone. My father, my brother Tyler, my grandmother. Each call peeling back another layer of the same devastating fact. This wasn't a scramble. This was a decision. A coordinated, collective, already made decision, delivered to me with just enough runway that I had no time left to fight it. I stood at the end of that aisle in my wedding dress. Rows of Marcus's family, rows of my closest friends, and an entire section, my parents, my siblings, my grandmother, completely empty. Every single chair. I want you to really see that image, because I lived inside it in real time, marrying the love of my life while my own blood had chosen, quite literally, to be somewhere else. I smiled. I said my vows. I don't remember most of the ceremony itself, if I'm honest, because I was doing the specific, exhausting work of not letting my own wedding become the day I cried through my own photos. That's a skill nobody should ever have to build. I built it in about 90 minutes. My father did show up. Eventually, halfway through my reception. Alone. He explained, uncomfortably, that he'd slipped away once Melissa's celebration wrapped up, which meant, functionally, he chose to stay for the entire thing before coming to see any part of mine. I felt two things at once, standing there in my reception dress. Real relief that at least one parent had made some effort, and fresh, sharp anger, because the timing of his arrival told me everything about where his priorities had actually sat all day. Now the 3 weeks. I want to slow down here, because the silence itself was its own kind of injury. Minimal communication. Deflection every single time I tried to bring it up directly. My siblings avoiding the topic entirely. An uncomfortable void that somehow stung almost as much as the original absence. And slowly, through extended family members who'd actually been at Melissa's celebration, people with no reason to hide anything from me, the real timeline surfaced. The vow renewal was never spontaneous. Melissa's husband had been planning it for nearly 6 weeks, meaning well before my own wedding date had even arrived, meaning my entire family had known about this exact conflict for 6 full weeks and said absolutely nothing. I want you to really process that. They didn't make a panicked, last-minute call under real-time pressure. They made a calculated decision, weeks in advance, and specifically withheld it from me until the exact morning I had zero time left to do anything about it. Telling me earlier would have meant giving me room to fight. So they didn't. I confronted my mother 2.5 weeks after my wedding. One of the hardest conversations of our entire relationship. You knew for 6 weeks. I told her, my voice carrying an anger I'd been controlling with everything I had for over 2 weeks straight. You let me walk down that aisle without my family there. And you waited until the very last morning to even tell me. Because you knew if you told me sooner, I might have actually had the time to fight for my wedding to matter as much as hers. Her response is the sentence I will never fully recover from. Melissa's marriage has always felt more fragile than yours. We worry that if we didn't show up for this, given some of the difficulties she and her husband have had, it might genuinely damage their relationship. Your marriage to Marcus has always felt so solid. We didn't think our absence would threaten anything important for you. Read it again. My own stability, the thing I'd worked hardest to build, was used as the exact justification for why I didn't deserve my family in the room. My strength disqualified me from support. Melissa's presumed fragility earned her a level of priority mine had specifically never received. I thought that was rock bottom. It wasn't close. 3 weeks after my wedding, my phone rang again. My mother. And for one stupid, hopeful second, I actually let myself believe this might be the apology I'd been waiting 3 weeks for. I wanted to talk to you about something, she said, in a tone I recognized instantly as transactional rather than emotional. Melissa and her husband are dealing with some unexpected costs from the vow renewal. The venue charged more than they budgeted for. With everything else going on financially for them right now, we were hoping as a family we could all pitch in to help cover the difference. I know things are probably tight for you and Marcus too, being newly married, but even a small contribution would really help. Sit with that. 3 weeks after skipping my actual wedding for that exact celebration, my own mother called to ask me to help fund it. You're asking me to help pay for the party you all chose over my wedding, I said, flat, exhausted, disbelieving. Mom, do you understand how that sounds? Do you understand what you're actually asking me to do right now? Silence. Not the guilty kind. The confused kind. The silence of someone genuinely, completely unprepared for the idea that this request could land as anything other than an ordinary, reasonable family ask. That silence told me more than any argument could have. This wasn't a one-time failure of judgment. This was simply how our family had always worked, and I was only now, for the first time in my entire adult life, looking directly at it instead of around it. I declined to contribute. Predictably, that produced fresh tension. My mother, and eventually Melissa herself, characterizing my refusal as selfishness, a lack of family loyalty. I want you to sit with the audacity of that accusation for a second, because I still do, regularly, sometimes at completely random moments in my day. I want to slow way down now, because the aftermath of this deserves its own honest, unhurried telling, not just a highlight reel of confrontation scenes. But first, let me give you one more scene from that day, because I've been holding it back, and I think you need it before we move forward. My reception happened at the same venue, a converted barn about 200 feet from where I'd said my vows. String lights, long farmhouse tables, the kind of setup I'd spent months choosing fabric swatches for, agonizing over centerpiece heights, genuinely believing every single decision mattered because my family would be there to see it. I stood at the entrance of that barn for my grand entrance, the moment where everyone claps, where you scan the room for the faces that matter most. And I want to describe exactly what I did in that specific second because I think about it constantly. I looked, instinctively, automatically, toward the table where my parents were supposed to be sitting. Empty. Two empty chairs with little calligraphy place cards that said Mother of the Bride and Father of the Bride, sitting there for the entire cocktail hour like small, cruel props in a play nobody had told me I was performing in. My Aunt Roberta, my mother's own sister, who had, mercifully, chosen to come to my wedding instead of Melissa's party, caught me looking at those chairs and grabbed my hand under the table without a word. She didn't say anything about it the whole reception. She didn't need to. That silent hand on mine is one of the only things from that entire day I remember with total, unclouded clarity. I want to tell you about the toasts too, because they matter to this story in a way I didn't expect at the time. My maid of honor, Priya, gave a toast that started warm and funny, and then, about halfway through, without any warning, without me knowing she was going to do it, she looked directly at the empty seats and said, simply, "Some of the people who should be here tonight aren't. And I want Danielle to know that the people who are here see her completely." The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone suddenly understands they're witnessing something real instead of scripted. I cried for the first time that whole day, right there, in front of 120 guests, most of whom had no idea what had actually happened that morning. I found out later, much later, through a cousin who'd been at both events somehow, splitting her afternoon between the two, some of the specific details of what Melissa's vow renewal actually looked like while I was standing at that altar. A live string quartet, a photo booth, a cake that, according to the same cousin, cost more than the cake at Melissa's actual wedding 8 years earlier. This wasn't a modest, quiet gesture between two people renewing their commitment to each other. This was a full production, with a guest list, with a program, with enough advance planning that a caterer had needed 6 weeks' notice to prepare for it. I want to tell you about the specific week after my wedding, before the extended family information started trickling in, because that week alone was its own particular kind of hell. Marcus and I had planned a short honeymoon. 4 days, a cabin a few hours away, nothing elaborate. And I spent most of it in a strange, suspended state, trying to be present for my own marriage, while simultaneously replaying the entire morning on a loop I couldn't turn off. Marcus, to his enormous credit, didn't try to fix it or minimize it. He just kept saying the same thing, over and over, gently, whenever I spiraled. "I saw you. I was there. That's real, whatever else happened." I've held on to that phrase almost as tightly as I've held on to Priya's toast. Now, back to the months that followed, because they required real, sustained work. Reduced contact with most of my family, not dramatic estrangement, just deliberate distance while I figured out what I actually needed. Individual therapy, specifically to start unpacking decades of favoritism I had spent my entire life minimizing, explaining away, rationalizing on my family's behalf, without ever once asking myself why I felt the need to do that work for them. I want to describe what that therapy actually looked like, because I think the specific mechanics of it matter to anyone reading this who might be sitting in a similar fog right now, unable to fully name what they're looking at. My therapist had me build, over several sessions, an actual timeline. Every instance of unequal treatment I could remember, going back as far as elementary school, written out in a notebook I still have. Seeing them all listed together, dated, specific, was different from simply feeling them accumulate over the years. On paper, the pattern wasn't debatable anymore. It wasn't a feeling I could talk myself out of. It was just documented, plain fact, page after page. I want to describe one particular session because it cracked something open for me. My therapist asked me to describe, in detail, the exact moment I decided, as a child, to stop commenting on these disparities out loud. I hadn't ever thought about it as a decision before. It had always felt like something that simply happened to me, a personality trait, being the easy one. But sitting with the question, I actually found the memory. 9 years old, pointing out that Melissa got a bigger slice of birthday cake, and being told, gently but firmly, that I was being difficult and should be grateful for what I had. I decided, that day, at 9 years old, that noticing out loud cost more than it was worth. I carried that decision for 26 more years without ever examining it once. About 4 months after the wedding, once I had enough distance and enough therapeutic scaffolding to approach it without raw, reactive anger, I asked for a direct, comprehensive conversation with both my parents together, deliberately together, so I wouldn't end up managing two separate, conflicting versions of the same fight. I want to describe the logistics of setting up that conversation, because even that took real effort. I sent my mother a text, specifically, asking for a sit-down with both her and my father present, no other family members, at a time when we could talk without interruption. She initially suggested including Melissa so we can all clear the air together, a suggestion I declined immediately and firmly because I understood, even then, that adding Melissa to that particular conversation would let the whole thing collapse into a referendum on my relationship with my sister rather than what it actually needed to be, an honest conversation with the two people who had, together, made the decision that emptied my wedding. This wasn't about one wedding day, I told them, once we were finally sitting across from each other at their kitchen table, the same table, incidentally, where I'd once been told to be grateful for a smaller slice of cake. Even though that day alone was devastating enough on its own. This is the clearest, most obvious example of a pattern that's existed my entire life. Melissa's needs, her celebrations, her difficulties, have always mattered more in this family than mine have. I need you to actually hear that, not as an accusation, as something true about how this family has functioned for decades. I want to describe how each of them responded, because it wasn't identical, and the difference mattered enormously to how I've rebuilt things since. My father absorbed it. Genuinely, I believe. In a separate, quieter conversation later, over coffee, just the two of us, he acknowledged specific memories, his own, unprompted, of moments across my entire childhood and adulthood where the family's collective attention had disproportionately tilted toward Melissa, without anyone ever pausing to notice what that cost the rest of us. He told me, that day, about a specific memory of his own, driving me to a piano recital when I was 12, alone, because my mother had stayed home to help Melissa prepare for a much smaller school event, and how he'd never once, until our conversation, connected that memory to anything larger. It wasn't a perfect reckoning, but it was real, and it was more than I expected. My mother's process has been slower, considerably slower. At that same kitchen table conversation, her first response was defensive. I don't think that's fair. We've always loved you both equally. A sentence I'd heard some version of my entire life. One that never once, in over 3 decades, was followed by any actual acknowledgement of the specific, documented patterns sitting in the notebook in my bag. 14 months out from the wedding, her process remains, honestly, incomplete, enough that I still have to hold firm, deliberate boundaries with her in ways I don't have to with my father anymore. We talk. We see each other at holidays. But I no longer share the parts of my life that used to feel safest to share with a mother because I've learned, expensively, exactly how that information sometimes gets used. I want to tell you about Tyler, because his part of this matters too. He reached out to me about 2 months after the wedding, completely unprompted, and told me he'd been thinking about our old conversation, the background characters conversation, nonstop since everything happened. He's begun, slowly, articulating his own long-standing awareness of the exact same favoritism dynamic shaping his relationship with our parents, describing patterns from his own life that mirrored mine almost exactly, just with different specific details. We've grown closer through this, comparing notes the way we probably should have been doing our entire lives, if either of us had had the language for it sooner. He was, notably, the second family member, after my Aunt Roberta, to fully, unequivocally take my side once the full timeline came out, and I don't think I'll ever forget that he didn't hedge, didn't try to see both sides, didn't ask me to be the bigger person. He just said, "That's messed up, and I'm sorry I didn't call you sooner that day." Melissa is the relationship that's changed the most, probably permanently. I want to be fair here. I don't believe she personally engineered the scheduling conflict or its concealment. That responsibility, from what I've since pieced together, sits mostly with her husband, who apparently wanted to surprise her badly enough that he didn't think through, or didn't care about, the collision he was creating. But her response once everything came fully into the light, including her willingness to call my refusal to fund her party selfish, including a message she sent me, weeks later, that read, in part, "I think you're being really petty about this. It's not like we did it on purpose to hurt you." Told me something I can't unsee anymore. She is entirely, comfortably at home inside a family system that has always worked in her favor. That comfort is its own kind of complicity, even if she never planned a single logistical detail herself. We speak now, occasionally, at required family functions. It is not the relationship we had before, and I've made a kind of peace with the fact that it may never be again. It's been just over 14 months now since that wedding day. Marcus and I have built what I genuinely believe is a strong, happy marriage, one I've come to understand, with real clarity, was never actually in danger that day. Exactly the way my mother predicted. Just not remotely for the reasons she meant when she made that specific, painful calculation. Our stability came from Marcus and me, from the actual foundation we built together, not from whether my extended family happened to occupy chairs at a ceremony. I think, often, about the specific cruelty folded inside my mother's original explanation, that our solidness as a couple was precisely what made us safe to sacrifice. I've come to understand that explanation as revealing something uncomfortable but genuinely important about how favoritism actually functions inside families. It rarely announces itself directly. It disguises itself as reasonable triage, as sensible prioritizing, right up until the exact day it doesn't. The day it shows its whole shape at once, on an occasion too significant to explain away anymore. If your family has ever chosen someone else's celebration over your biggest, most significant day, and then circled back weeks later asking you to help fund the very thing that caused the original harm, I want to hear how you survived both parts of that. Not just the day itself, the part after, where you have to decide what your family actually gets to be to you going forward. I used to believe certain moments, weddings specifically, existed in some kind of protected category within families, immune to the ordinary, smaller favoritism that might quietly shape everything else. I've learned, in the most expensive way a person can learn something, that nothing is actually protected, not even the days you need protection the most. And sometimes the clearest, most undeniable proof of a lifelong pattern arrives exactly on the one day you most needed your family to finally, completely show up.